"Move, old man," Braden Whitfield growled, and the whole bar felt the words land before it understood them. Why does an old farmer in a clay-colored coat sit alone at the end of the bar every first Friday, never ordering more than black coffee, staring at the fireplace wall like he's waiting for something to finally speak back? Nobody at the Whitfield Trailhead Saloon had ever asked out loud. They only noticed him the way you notice a fence post, a fixture too plain to be worth the question. Until tonight, when the fixture didn't sit down where it was supposed to. Braden was 34 years old, 6 wins deep into a Friday night that had already made him money and made his name louder. Forearms still flexed from the last challenger he'd folded onto the bar top like a paper fan. He had inherited this room from his father 3 years back and had spent every one of those years teaching it his rules, his wager, his chalk tally, his crowd. Virgil Culpepper was 76, and he had walked through that door in a canvas coat gone the color of creek clay, moving with the unhurried economy of a man who had long since stopped needing to prove how fast he could be. When the crowd at the arm wrestling table parted for him out of pure habit, assuming he wanted the empty stool at the rail, Virgil didn't stop there. He kept walking, past the table, past the tally board, toward the low stone hearth and the black iron shape mounted above it. And that was when Braden's hand shot out and blocked him, friendly and final as a gate closing. "Move, old man," he said again, softer now, almost a joke for the room's benefit. "Fireplace ain't a rest stop, friend. Bar's that-a-way." The room laughed, easy and reflexive, the way rooms laugh at things they haven't looked at closely. Virgil didn't laugh. He didn't argue either. He simply stood there a moment, weight settled back on his heels, hat brim throwing a small shadow over eyes that were already lifted past Braden's shoulder, fixed on the dark iron shape bolted above the mantel, like a man reading a letter from across a room he hadn't been in for years. Somewhere behind that stillness sat 60 years, a filed notch, a dead father's hands, and a debt this bar didn't know it was carrying. None of that showed on his face. What showed was patience, the specific patience of a man who has waited so long for one particular thing that 6 more minutes costs him nothing at all. If you've ever been the steady one nobody noticed until the room needed you, type steady below. Whatever it was Virgil Culpepper had driven 40 minutes on a 2-lane county road to find, it wasn't a stool, and it wasn't a drink, and it wasn't, whatever Braden Whitfield believed in that instant, a wrong turn made by a confused old man wandering the wrong end of his own bar. The tally board behind them still read 6 wins, chalk white and gleaming under the string lights. And not one person in that crowded room understood yet that the real contest of the night hadn't started at the wrestling table at all. It had started the moment Virgil's eyes found the anvil, and it would not end until something in that iron finally answered him back. Virgil's left hand told most of the story, if anyone had cared to read it. It curled faintly inward at rest, permanently, the way a green branch holds the shape of the wind that first bent it, and along the pad of his thumb ran a burn scar shaped like a crescent moon, pale and shining even under bar light, laid down so long ago it had gone smooth as a river stone. He kept that hand mostly in his coat pocket, not from shame, but from habit, the way a man keeps a tool sheathed until the moment calls for it. In that pocket, his fingers found what they always found first in any new room: a ring of iron keys on the leather fob, worn soft and dark as saddle leather. 5 keys and a 6th that wasn't a key at all anymore, filed down at some point to a single notch, fitting no lock Virgil owned or had owned in 11 years. He touched it once, the way another man might touch a coin in his pocket for luck, and let it go. He hummed then, so low that only the air right around his mouth could have caught it. 4 notes and no more. The opening bars of a hymn nobody in that saloon would have recognized, even if the string lights had gone silent to let it through. It was the hymn Ruby used to hum in September, elbow deep in canning jars, tomatoes going soft and red in the boiling water while she worked the counter in their kitchen, and never once sang past the 4th bar before some new task pulled her attention away. Virgil had never finished it for her. In 6 years, since she'd gone quiet in her sleep on an ordinary Tuesday night, heart just easing itself to a stop the way a clock winds down. He had never once let himself sing past that fourth note either. It felt, some nights, like the only promise he still knew how to keep. He wore that coat, canvas gone the color of the clay along Route 9, over a flannel shirt soft enough at the collar to show how many winters it had already survived, and a felt hat whose sweat-darkened band told anyone paying attention exactly how many summers it had shaded. Nothing on him had been bought in this decade. Everything on him had been earned in some other one. A stranger glancing his way would have seen only an old farmer out past his bedtime, clothes worn thin, hands closed like he was cold. What they would not have seen, because it does not show on the outside, was the particular arithmetic of his life. 19 the year he'd enlisted, 22 the year he came home, and every year since spent at a forge and an anvil that had outlasted 3 farm dogs, 1 marriage's worth of arguments and apologies, and, eventually, Ruby herself. He did not introduce himself to anyone in that bar. He did not need to, not yet. He simply stood near the hearth a moment longer, coat pocket empty now of the small weight his fingers had checked, him folded back down into silence, waiting the way he had waited every first Friday for 3 years running, for a chance nobody else in the room knew was coming. Braden Whitfield had earned every bit of the noise around him, and it would be a lie to say otherwise. 3 challengers deep into the night, he had put down a logging contractor built like a wood stove, a college wrestler home for the summer, and a trucker who'd bragged for 20 minutes before Braden slammed his knuckles flat in under 4 seconds. He worked the table like a man born to it, elbows set, eyes locked, voice pitched for the whole room and not just his opponent. And when he won, he didn't gloat so much as invite the room to feel it with him. Arms wide, grin easy, friend rolling off his tongue for every new face at the table like a title he was bestowing. The Iron Furrow Riders, his weekend club, ring the table 2 and 3 deep in leather and pride, and every laugh that rolled through the saloon that night rolled through them first. It was real skill, whatever else it was. A man who has beaten 41 straight comers on a hand-chalked board has usually beaten more than luck to get there. And Braden had the forearms and the instinct to prove it, reading an opponent's shoulder drop half a second before they committed to it, saving his true strength for the last half-inch of the match, the way a good poker player saves his best card. He was 34 and undefeated, and he had built something out of his father's saloon that his father himself might not have recognized. Louder, faster, hungrier for an audience, but not fake. Braden Whitfield was good at exactly what he did. Which was why it struck the room as almost funny when the same steady confidence turned toward Virgil Culpepper crossing the floor toward the hearth. Slow as a man wading a creek by feel, careful of a floor he had crossed better than they knew. "Careful there," Braden called out, still grinning at his last victory. "Unless you're aiming to fight that anvil next, friend, you might be a while getting there." Laughter again, warmer this time, easy, the kind that comes when a crowd believes it has permission. One of the riders, a broad-shouldered man with a patch reading furrow stitched crooked over his heart, called out that the old man was probably looking for the men's room and got turned around. And another offered, not unkindly, to walk him there himself. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was the confidence of young men who had never once needed to imagine that a slow walk could carry 60 years of purpose inside it, that a man's gait could be economical rather than lost, that patience and confusion can look from across a crowded room like the exact same thing. Virgil didn't answer any of it. He kept walking at the same unbothered pace, one hand trailing along the bar rail for balance and nothing more. And something about his silence, rather than deflating the joke, seemed to feed it. Braden leaned back against the wrestling table, arms crossed, watching with the indulgent amusement of a king observing a harmless subject wander his hall, already turning back to the next challenger stepping up to face him, some kid from 2 towns over eager to be the 7th name on the chalkboard. "He'll find his way," Braden said, mostly to himself now, mostly satisfied. "They always do." He did not see, because he had already looked away, the exact moment Virgil's gaze lifted from the floor to the black iron shape mounted above the hearth, nor the way something in the old man's shoulders settled, the way a man's shoulders settle when a long-carried weight finally sees where it's meant to be set down. The room had already returned to its noise, its chalk tally, its next handshake and next slap of palms locking together at the table, and none of it noticed that the real event of the evening had just quietly changed addresses, moving from the bar top to the hearth, from Braden Whitfield's forearm to an old man's hand. Virgil reached the hearth and stopped there the way another man might stop before a grave, not out of grief exactly, but out of a respect too old to perform for anyone watching. He said nothing. He let his right hand rise first, knuckles trailing along the cool stone of the mantel, the specific unhurried motion of a man reading Braille he had written himself decades before. Then let it drop to the iron tool rack bolted beside the fireplace, tongs and poker, and a small flat shovel gone dark with age. His fingers moving over each piece the way a man's fingers move over the spines of books he already knows the order of by heart. Lindsay Rainey, 41 years old and 2 stools down nursing a beer she'd been nursing for an hour, felt herself take a half step back from the bar without deciding to, the way a person moves clear of a hot stove they haven't consciously registered yet. She would not have been able to say why. Something about the old man's stillness had changed the air around him, pulled the temperature down half a degree, and her body understood it before her mind caught up enough to feel foolish for stepping back from an old farmer in a barn coat. Spencer Stubbs noticed differently. 29 years old, a patch-wearing rider who had spent 3 years around Braden's table and thought he'd seen every version of confidence a man could carry into that room. Spencer went very still at the edge of the crowd, beer forgotten in his hand, watching not Virgil's face, but his hands. He'd grown up around a grandfather who worked a forge on weekends for pocket money, and something in the exact angle of Virgil's wrist as it moved along the iron rack, the specific economy of it, no wasted motion, no hesitation, the touch of a man checking work rather than admiring decor, pulled at a memory Spencer couldn't quite name yet. He didn't laugh with the others this time. He just watched, quiet, the way you watch weather you're not sure is going to pass over or come straight for you. Reed Millwood watched longer than either of them, because it was his job that night to watch the whole room, and because something about Virgil had caught his attention the moment the old man walked through the door instead of toward it. 24 years old, 2 years behind this same bar, Reed had grown up on his grandfather's stories about a Culpeper anvil, some half-remembered local legend from the days before the Trailhead Saloon existed at all, when the building down the road had been a veterans hall with a working forge in its back lot. He'd never put much stock in the story. It was the kind of thing old men told young men to fill a slow porch evening. But he watched Virgil's hand move along that iron rack with the unmistakable care of ownership rather than confusion, watched him bypass the poker and go straight for the flat shovel, turning it once in the low light like he was checking its balance rather than its shine. And Reed understood, with a small, cold certainty he couldn't yet explain to anyone, that this man was not lost. He was looking for something, specifically, in a room he already half knew by heart. He didn't say anything either. He just set down the glass he'd been drying and came a little closer, the way you come closer to a door you suspect is about to open. Virgil reached up toward the anvil itself last, the black iron mass mounted on a routed wooden bracket above the mantel, high enough that most customers had to tip their heads back to really look at it, low enough that a man of Virgil's height, arm fully extended, could just brush its underside with his fingertips. The bar light did not reach that shadowed hollow beneath the iron. He didn't need it to. His fingers moved along the curve of the horn, down across the flat of the face, and around to the underside where the metal had been left rough on purpose, the way a maker leaves his own work unfinished in the one place no customer would ever think to look. He found the notch by feel, a single filed groove, no longer than a fingernail, cut deliberately off-center from where any decorative maker's mark would have gone, and his hand went still against it, the way a man's hand goes still when it finally finds a pulse it was afraid it wouldn't. The room had not gone quiet yet. Braden was still laughing with the riders at the wrestling table, chalk in his hand, ready to add a 7th name to the tally when Virgil spoke. Not loud, not raised for effect, just clear enough to carry across 20 feet of suddenly listening air. "My father and I made this anvil," he said, "and the tools beside it, for the old hall down the road, before it closed. 31 years, we shod and forged and mended for that place, and I filed this notch myself the week they told us the hall was done." The laughter at the table didn't stop all at once. It thinned, the way water thins before it finally runs clear, voices trailing off as heads turned. The seventh challenger's raised hand forgotten mid-motion. Braden set the chalk down slowly, more out of instinct than belief, and looked from the old man's face to the dark shape above the hearth and back again, already shaking his head before he'd fully decided to. "That's not right," he said, and there was no meanness in it now, only the flat confusion of a man whose ground had just tilted half a degree beneath him. "That anvil came with papers, old-timer. Bill of sale says a different name entirely. Man a lot more famous than a farmer, no offense. You sure you're not thinking of someplace else?" Virgil lowered his hand from the iron, slow, unhurried, the crescent scar on his thumb catching the light for just a moment before his hand slid back into his coat pocket to rest against the ring of keys. "I'm sure," he said, and said nothing more. And the silence that followed sat in that room like a held breath. Nobody yet understood the reason for. Braden went to the office safe himself, because a man doesn't argue paperwork he hasn't looked at in 3 years, and came back out with a manila folder gone soft at the corners, laying it open on the bar top under the string lights, the way he might have laid out a winning hand. The bill of sale inside was real, notarized, dated 11 years back, bearing a raised seal from a regional auction house, and a signature Braden's own father had once trusted enough to frame nothing more than a receipt over. It listed the anvil and companion fireplace tool set as the work of a blacksmith whose name half the room recognized from county fair placards, and a documentary that had once aired on the local public station. A man 3 decades dead, and a full generation more famous than any Culpepper had ever tried to be. "I didn't buy a lie, friend," Braden said, not unkindly, more like a man reassuring himself out loud. "This came through a licensed house, everything proper. I was 11 years old when my daddy hung that thing up, and I've had 30-some regulars ask about it since, and not one of them ever said different." Virgil looked at the paper without picking it up, the way a man looks at a photograph of a place he has actually stood in. "Paper's only as honest as the man who wrote it," he said, and that was all. It was Reed who found the second problem, not in the folder, but in the black reservation book kept behind the bar for private events and after-hours arrangements, flipping back through it with the particular urgency of a man trying to outrun a bad feeling. He found the entry for that night near the bottom of the page, written in Braden's own hand 3 weeks prior. "Collector arriving 9 p.m. Final payment. Pieces to be crated and hauled same evening." Reed read it twice before he said it aloud, and when he did, the room's temperature dropped again, the way it had when Lindsay Rainey stepped back from the bar without knowing why. 9 o'clock, Reed said. "Braden, that's tonight. That's in under 6 hours. Braden's jaw tightened, less at Virgil now than at the sudden math of his own evening rearranging itself in front of him. He'd signed that deal in good faith, a fair price for decor he genuinely believed was exactly what the paperwork said it was. And now an old man in a clay-stained coat was standing at his hearth insisting the whole provenance was rotten, with nothing to prove it but a filed notch only he claimed to recognize, and a story about a hall that hadn't stood in over a decade. "If there's a ledger," Braden said slowly, "something that actually says your family made this, bring it. I'm not trying to cheat anybody, but I can't hand a paying customer nothing but an old man's word against a notarized bill of sale." Virgil's face didn't change, but something in his stillness deepened, the particular stillness of a man revisiting a loss he'd already grieved once. "There was a ledger," he said. "Every commission, every mark, every name we ever forged for. It went into the same clearance sale as everything else, 11 years back, when the hall closed its doors for good. I never saw where it went after that." He paused, eyes on the anvil rather than on Braden. "Man's word is thin, I'll grant you, but it's all that's left standing on my side of this." The clock above the register read a little past 3, 9 o'clock, and the 6 hours between now and then had just become the only shape the evening had left. Reed didn't go back to the reservation book right away. He went further, into the thin drawer beneath the register where Braden kept the actual sale correspondence. The emails printed and paper-clipped, the way his father had always insisted on doing things, distrustful of anything that lived only on a screen. It took him 4 minutes to find the broker's name typed at the bottom of the most recent letter, arranging tonight's final walkthrough and payment on behalf of a client too far away to attend the original purchase 11 years back. Reed read the name twice, quietly, before he said it loud enough for Braden to hear over the low murmur that had settled across the room. "Grover Ellsworth," Reed said. "Braden, this is the same name on the original auction catalog, the 11-year-old one. He ran the clearance sale that sold this anvil out of the Veterans Hall in the first place. And he's the one arranging tonight's sale, too." Braden took the paper from Reed's hand and read it himself, lips moving slightly the way a man's do when he's hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something less complicated. They didn't. The same regional auctioneer who had cataloged, labeled, and sold this anvil and its tool set 11 years ago under a famous stranger's name was now the very broker standing between Braden's saloon and tonight's buyer, still profiting, quietly, off a description he had written himself over a decade ago, and never once had to defend in front of the man who actually forged the iron. "That doesn't prove he lied," Braden said, but the certainty had gone out of his voice, replaced by something closer to a man listening for a second opinion he already suspected he wasn't going to like. The second opinion arrived 9 minutes later, through the saloon's front door, in the shape of a broad-shouldered man of 79, with a county fire marshal's old bearing still folded into his spine, who stopped just inside the threshold and looked past the wrestling table, past the chalkboard, past Braden Whitfield entirely, straight at Virgil Culpepper standing by the hearth. "Virgil," the man said, and something in the single syllable made half the room turn. It was Lester Stanhope, retired now from the county, but not from the years he'd spent decades ago attached to the same Army bridging unit as the man standing at the fireplace. The two of them 19 and 22 once, together, in a place this bar's regulars had only ever heard mentioned on television. Reed had called him an hour earlier, on a hunch he couldn't fully explain. Some half-remembered mention from his grandfather of a Culpepper who'd served with a Stanhope, and the number had still been good after all these years. Lester crossed the floor with the unhurried authority of a man used to rooms quieting for him, and when he reached the hearth, he did something that made even Braden's easy showmanship falter into silence. He came to attention, spine straightening, chin lifting, boots together, the whole practiced geometry of a salute he hadn't had official cause to give in decades, and said, voice cracking clean down the middle on the last word, "Sergeant, it's an honor." Nobody laughed this time. Nobody in that room, not the riders, not the regulars, not Braden Whitfield himself, had ever seen an old farmer in a clay-stained coat receive that particular silence before. The kind that isn't empty, but full. The kind a room gives when it finally understands it has been standing in the presence of something it never had the eyes to see. Lester lowered his hand and reached into his jacket, drawing out a folded printout he'd pulled from his truck's glove box on the drive over. The buyer's information Reed had texted him 20 minutes earlier. He studied the name at the top a long moment, and something crossed his face that hadn't been there when he'd walked in. A private grief surfacing fast and then folding itself back down. The way men of his generation had learned to do with grief in general. "This buyer," Lester said slowly, "this family name. I know it." He looked up at Virgil. "That's Corporal Aldridge's grandson. Same Aldridge that pulled the pin on the flooded span outside Playcou. Same one you and I hauled out of that river in '68, Virgil. Ellsworth told that family this anvil carried a war hero's true legacy. He wasn't wrong about the war hero. He was wrong about whose hands made it." He folded the paper back along its crease, voice gone rough. "That boy's family isn't buying decor tonight. They think they're buying a piece of their grandfather's honor, and they were about to pay for a lie built on the exact unit that man served in." The room had gone fully silent now, the kind of silence that isn't waiting for a joke to land, because for the first time all night, Nobody in the Whitfield Trailhead Saloon was under any illusion about which end of the bar the real history had been standing at. Lester Stanhope did not sit down. He stood at the hearth beside Virgil, the way a man stands beside a marker at a grave he has visited before. And when he spoke again, it was not to the room, but through it, loud enough to reach every corner Braden's own voice had commanded an hour earlier. "Sergeant Virgil Culpepper," he said. "Army Corps of Engineers, Bridging Unit, Central Highlands, 66 to 69. Man beside me kept half our equipment running on nothing but scrap iron and stubbornness when the supply lines couldn't reach us for weeks at a stretch. I have known this man 56 years, and I have never once heard him raise his voice to claim credit for anything, which is likely why none of you had the first idea who was standing at your fireplace tonight." Braden Whitfield stood very still behind the bar, both hands flat against the wood, the chalk tally board behind him suddenly looking like the smallest thing in the room. He did not argue the notarized paper again. He did not mention the sale, or the 9 o'clock deadline, or the money already promised. He simply looked at Virgil the way a man looks at something he has spent all night mistaking for background. "Sergeant," Braden said, testing the word, unpracticed and careful. "I owe you an apology I don't know how to make big enough." Virgil shook his head slightly, the same economy of motion he'd used at the tool rack, nothing wasted. "Owed apologies are the easiest kind to make," he said. "You just make them plain, and you make them once." Braden nodded, throat working, and asked the question that had clearly been sitting in him since Lester's voice had cracked on the word honor. Whether Virgil wanted the anvil back outright, whether he wanted the sale money instead, whatever made it right. It was, in its way, a generous offer from a man who had just watched his whole evening's certainty come apart in front of a room he'd built his name in. Virgil looked at the iron a long moment before he answered, hand drifting once more to the ring of keys in his coat pocket, the notched sixth one warm now from all the handling it had taken that night. "I don't want the anvil taken down," he said. "It stood over that hearth 11 years without anybody knowing what it was. Leave it up. Just letter the true names onto a card beside it. My father's name first, mine after his, if there's room." He paused, and something in his face loosened, the particular loosening of a man setting down a weight he has carried so long it had become part of his posture. "I didn't come back for the anvil. I came back because it still remembers her hands were never on it, and mine were." The room didn't fully understand the sentence, not yet. Not until Virgil went on, voice steady, quieter now, the plainest register he'd used all night. He told them briefly, the way a man tells a truth he has rehearsed only in silence, that his wife Ruby had died 6 years back on an ordinary Tuesday night, heart stopping soft in her sleep the way a clock winds down rather than breaks, and that in the year after she'd passed, he'd found himself unable to sit in his own kitchen of an evening, without the quiet pressing in on him from every corner. He'd started driving out here instead, first Friday of every month, not for the noise or the crowd, but because this room held the one thing he and his father had made that had survived the closing of the hall, the auction, the 11 years since, still standing, still whole, waiting the way he had learned to wait. He'd never once come inside to claim it. He'd come to be near it, the way another man might visit a grave, until tonight, when the notch under his fingers finally had somewhere to be spoken. Nobody in that bar laughed at him now. Lindsay Rainey, still 2 stools down, had both hands pressed flat over her mouth. Spencer Stubbs stood with his beer forgotten entirely, the memory of his grandfather's forge finally arriving all the way into place. And Reed Millwood, 24 years old and 2 years behind this bar, understood at last exactly why the old stories his own grandfather used to tell on slow porch evenings had never once felt made up. Braden Whitfield picked up a pen from behind the register that same hour and drafted, by his own hand, the letter Grover Ellsworth would receive before the collector's truck ever left the driveway. The sale was off, the provenance was false, and any future piece bearing Ellsworth's paperwork would be independently verified before it touched the Trailhead Saloon's walls again. He made the call to the Aldridge family himself, rather than let his broker make it for him. And when Corporal Aldridge's grandson arrived a little after 8 that evening, expecting to close a purchase. Braden met him at the door and told him the truth instead of the story he'd been sold, that the anvil above the hearth had never belonged to a famous stranger, but to the two men who'd once hauled his own grandfather out of a flooded river in the Central Highlands, and that it was not for sale at any price, though he was welcome always to come sit beneath it and hear the real thing. Reed found a thin card of pale wood behind the register 2 days later and lettered it himself in careful, unhurried print. Forged by Wendell Culpepper and Sergeant Virgil Culpepper for the veterans of Marrow Creek. He hung it on a small brass hook beside the anvil's bracket, and it was there, the following first Friday, that Virgil came one more time, not for coffee this time, and lifted the ring of notched keys from his coat pocket for the last time in that room. Hanging the leather fob on the hook just beneath the card, the filed sixth key finally resting where its lock had stood all along. He did not linger over it. He touched the iron once more, the same unhurried knuckle trail he'd used the first night, and walked out through the saloon's door into a parking lot gone soft and gold with the last of the evening light, not looking back, the way a man doesn't look back at a debt he has finally seen paid in full. 3 weeks later, in his own kitchen 40 minutes down the county road, Virgil put the kettle on the way he did most evenings, and while the water climbed toward its whistle, he found himself humming, low and unhurried, the same 4 notes he had always allowed himself. Except this time, his voice carried on past them, through the 5th bar and the 6th, all the way to the hymn's quiet end. Ruby's glasses catching the last window light on the sill above the sink the whole while, as if they too had been waiting for him to finish it. Some debts don't come due in court. They come due quietly, decades later, in the one room that still remembers.